Hey. I know you got that big essay due tomorrow and you want to bone up on T.S. Eliot's tradition and the individual talent. Nah, I'm just kidding. You would use ChatGPT for that. You wouldn't hit up my channel for that type of thing. You know that, and I know that. You're just here to have a good time, not for a long time. All right, let's dig into it. T.S. Eliot's tradition and the individual talent. We're just going to do the read through and discuss. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. We cannot refer to the tradition or a tradition. At most, we employ the adjective in saying that the poetry of so-and-so is traditional or even too traditional. Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure. If otherwise, is vaguely approbative with some implication as the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. You can hardly make the word agreeable to English ears without this comfortable reference to the reassuring science of archaeology. In other words, he's saying we kind of use the word tradition negatively when we're discussing poetry. We really don't conceive of this as a positive asset. So how is he going to reframe this? Certainly the word is not likely to appear in our appreciations of living or dead writers. Every nation, every race has not only its creative, but its own critical turn of mind, and even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits and those of its creative genius. In other words, it's hard to see your limitations as a critic, right? It's easier to see your limitations as a creative person, I guess. That's his opinion. I'm not sure that that's true. We know or think we know from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in the French language that the critical method or habit of the French, we only conclude, we are very much unconscious people, that the French are, quote, more critical than we, and sometimes even plume ourselves a little with the fact as if the French were less spontaneous. Perhaps they are, but we might remind ourselves that criticism is as inevitable as breathing. I certainly agree with Eliot here. I've said that before. And we should be none the worse for articulating what passes in our minds when we read a book or feel an emotion about it, for criticizing our minds in their work of criticism. For criticizing our own minds in their work of criticism. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. These aspects are parts of his work we pretend to find what is individual, what is the peculiar essence of the man. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. I think that's a cool point. This is kind of interesting. I don't know if it's provable or disprovable, but it's certainly an interesting passage here. And I do not mean the impressionable period of adolescence, but the period of full maturity. In other words, he's saying, when we read great writing, it seems to be kind of like great writing from the past. So like they kind of join the company of great writers and great poets from other periods when they're writing at their best. And it's kind of this weird thing that occurs when we read great poetry. It's all kind of part of this family of great poems that echo one another. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing that, again, can't be proven or disproven, but certainly a fascinating idea. Yet And I do think, great poems are more alike than they are. They are more similar than they are dissimilar in many ways. Great. There's only so many ways to be great. Right? If it is the only form of tradition of handing down consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in blind or timid adherence to its successes, quote, tradition should be positively discouraged. We've seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. Amen to that. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. Kind of an arbitrary number there, don't you think, Eliot? In the historical sense involves a perception not only of pastness of the past, but of the presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it, the whole of the literature of his own country has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. Well, that's a kind of a portentous way of saying, know your shit, right? This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as the temporal, and of the timeless and the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time and of his own contemporaneity. In other words, you can't understand what it means to be a writer in 2025 unless you really have a good understanding of other eras and other traditions and other periods, because otherwise, what is it about 2025? You have no awareness of the past. You have no understanding of how the past leads to the present. How exactly are you supposed to embody what it is to be alive today? I think that's sort of obvious, and it's not super profound. But let's see where it goes. Okay, no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to dead poets and artists. Okay, I can agree to that. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean, this is a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. Okay, that's a super cool idea, right? So, like, contributing something new also changes how we evaluate things in the past. That's super interesting. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the really new work of art among them. Cool. Super cool idea. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For the order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole order must be, if ever so slightly, altered, and so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And there's this conformity between the old and the new. And this is the conformity. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. Okay. So, I mean, it's kind of giving, like, poets today a lot of power and responsibility, but T.S. Eliot clearly wanted a lot of power and responsibility, and he wanted to be able to fiddle fuck with the past and mess with poems and reincorporate them and do cool stuff. So, okay, he's grabbing the mantle. All right, let's see where he goes with the mantle. In a peculiar sense, he will be aware also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated by them. Not judged to be as good as or worse or better than the dead, and certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. It is a judgment, a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. To conform merely would be for the new work not really to conform at all. It would not be new and would therefore not be a work of art. I'm not really sure how he defines newness here. It seems sort of subjective what newness is and what novelty is. He doesn't really define that term, but whatever. We'll go with it. We'll let him we'll just like kind of vibe with it here. We do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in, but its fitting in as a test of its value, a test, it is true, which can only be slowly and cautiously applied, for none of us are infallible judges of conformity. I mean, I think, like, tastes change so rapidly these days. We've, like, thrown out the baby with the bathwater on the canon, and no one agrees on very much of anything, and everyone just has taste, and there's really no objective standard anymore. Whether T.S. Eliot has anything to do with that fact is something that I'm curious to find out. I think he might have something to do with that fact, but let's see. Right now, he's definitely an advocate of the canon, right? The canon's fucking awesome, right? It appears to conform and is perhaps individual, or appears individual and may conform, but we are hardly likely to find that it is one and not the other. Okay, talking in circles, Mr. Eliot. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, yes, please do, sir. He can neither take the past as a lump, as an indiscriminate bolus. Oh, 20-point bonus word for ballast there. I can ballast this. Nor can he form himself wholly on one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred method. I don't know if people are forming themselves at all before they write poetry anymore, but all right. The first course is inadmissible. The second is an important experience of youth. The third is a pleasant, highly desirable supplement. The poet must be very conscious of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. Okay, so you can't just read great stuff, right? Okay. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but the material of art is never quite the same. I think that that's true, Eliot. I can't prove that that's true, but I'm agreeing with you. He must be aware of the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be more important than his own private mind, is a mind. Okay, so it's like this collective mind. There's a collective. It's like a Borg of poetry. You will be assimilated. He learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draftsman. This development, refinement perhaps, complication certainly, is not, from the point of view of the artist, any improvement. Okay, so art doesn't get better or worse, and literature doesn't get any better or worse. I certainly agree with that. I don't think there's like progress, strictly speaking, in art. Some people have argued to me that there is, and I think those people are stinky doo-doo heads. Perhaps not even an improvement from the point of view of the psychologist, or not to the extent which we imagine, perhaps only in the end based upon a complication in economics and machinery. Okay, I see where you're going with that. So we live in more complicated times, I suppose. So our poetry needs to reflect some of those things, maybe. I don't know. But the difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way and to an extent which the past awareness of itself cannot show. Yeah, that is fucking so true, man. Yeah, I have no fucking idea what that means. Someone said the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did, precisely, and they are that which we know. Okay, yeah, nice retort there. Okay. So it's like people eat people's meat, right? So it's like, you know, we know so much because we ate, you know, the people. We ate them. I know. I'm doing a great job here. Okay, let's get back to it. I am alive to a usual objection of what is clearly part of my program for the métier of poetry. The objection is that the doctrine requires a ridiculous amount of erudition, pedantry, a claim which can be rejected by appeal to the lives of poets in any pantheon. I'm not really sure what he's saying, but I would think not all poets are like super incredibly well educated. Some are, but some aren't. So you don't need to be like a super uber scholar in order to be an accomplished poet. It will even be affirmed that much learning deadens or perverts poetic sensibility. Okay, that's possible. I'm not actually sure that that's true or provable one way or another. It is provable that not all poets have studied enormous quantities all the time. While, however, we persist in believing that a poet ought to know as much as will not encroach upon his necessary receptivity and necessary laziness, it is not desirable to confine knowledge to whatever can be put into a useful shape for examinations, drawing rooms, or the still more pretentious modes of publicity. So in other words, if like you meet a poet and like you cross-examine them at a cocktail party, that's not a very good test, nor like giving them like a written exam, nor should we examine them and like, you know, read about them in glossy magazines and see who's the most smarty pantsness of them. None of those are good tests according to Eliot. Some can absorb knowledge, the more tardy must sweat for it. Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. Okay, so Shakespeare's famously like not like super highly educated. Like he wasn't a Cambridge man, right? So like he didn't attend the most prestigious institutions. He wasn't like an elite. He didn't come from a class background that would allow him to acquire that type of education, but nonetheless, the stuff that he did read and he did learn, he seemed to utilize very effectively in his poetry and plays, and there seems to be no lack of insight or historical awareness in his writing. He just derived it from a small number of sources, and he exploited it very effectively. Okay. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness through his career. So he's contrasting this idea of like book knowledge, book learning, book smarts versus this kind of like more like conceptual or like intuitive awareness of the past, and this awareness or sensitivity of the past is really what you're after. I totally kind of have a hard on for this view. It's totally fucking true. God, it's true. It's so profound. It's true though. No, it's good. What happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment something which is more valuable. To something which is more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. It goes a little far for me, but okay. You know, I could see that we overemphasize personality and identity way too much these days. So Eliot may be going the other way, but Eliot was kind of a personality in and of himself, kind of an eccentric dude, and so were all his buds. So I don't know, man. There remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition as this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. Now you're kind of out on a limb, dude. Science my butt, dude. All right, well, let's see where you go. I therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy the action which takes place when a bit of finely filleted platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. Well, it's now total like turntable man, like just like mix master Eliot here, just like jumped the tracks here, and like we're totally like going into like a different beat now, like it's gonna get like hot and heavy trance mode or something. Like now you're hitting like the science. We must take the research underground. And like everybody's getting nuts on the dance floor now with the sulfur dioxide, which I think when you mix these things, it's not going to be good for human life. But well, let's find out. He'll return to that later. Okay, so part 2. Honest criticism. Suppose the kind that, I write. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation. Now let's be sensitive. Is directed not upon the poet, but upon the poetry. Yeah, okay, Captain Obvious. If we attend to the confused cries of the newspaper critics and the susurrus, that's like what the sound leaves make in the woods, of popular repetition that follows, we shall hear the names of poets in great numbers. If we seek not blue book knowledge, but the enjoyment of poetry, and ask for a poem, we shall seldom find it. Oh, gosh. Okay, so he's saying even when we read poems, we're not really finding the poem. We're finding some other nonsense and hullabaloo because we're confused and we're idiotic. I've tried to point out the importance of the relation of the poem to other poems by other authors and suggested that the conception... I lost my cursor there. And the conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. That should be super easy to write criticism that way, right? I mean, just consider every poem ever written, and whenever you read a new poem, just like put it in context of absolutely everything all the time. No problem. Cool. As I hinted by an analogy that the mind of the mature poet differs from that of the immature one, not precisely in an evaluation of, quote, personality, not being necessarily more interesting or having more to say, but rather being a more finely perfected medium in which special or very varied feelings are at liberty to enter into new combinations. Okay, so he's continuing like this chemistry thing. Like as you become, more mature as a poet, maybe you have a little bit more kind of control over these elements that you're mixing, elements of your personality and experiences and whatnot, or maybe the drugs that you take. I don't know, man. Let's see. The analogy was that of the catalyst, when two gases previously mentioned are mixed in the presence of a filament of platinum. Ah, yeah. Since we're all rich, like T.S. Eliot, we'll have access to copious quantities of platinum. They form sulfurous acid. Sulfuric acid? Oh, I think it's sulfuric acid. This combination takes place only if the platinum is present. Nevertheless, the newly formed acid contains no trace of platinum. The platinum itself is apparently unaffected, has remained inert, neutral, and unchanged. Super cool idea, super left field. I don't know. I'm not really buying that poetry has anything to do with chemistry whatsoever, but it's a cool idea. It's like the soul of the poet is like the platinum, right? And like it can operate on these things and not be changed. And cool like things happen that are awesome. It may partly or exclusively operate upon the experience of the man himself, but the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers, and the mind which creates, the more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. So there's a little bit of like the JC, Jesus Christ thing, like he suffered for our sins and stuff, but like it didn't really change him permanently because he's JC, he just like went to heaven, but he transmuted all of our souls. So I think like for T.S. Eliot, some like mumbo jumbo around that stuff, man. Here, where it's like chemistry, but it's not chemistry, but it is, but it's not, but it's your soul, but it's JC. But I don't know. It was pretty heavy mumbo jumbo. The experience, you will notice the elements which enter the presence of the transforming catalyst are of two kinds, emotions and feelings. All right, Eliot, I'm not really sure what the difference between emotions and feelings are. I thought they're kind of synonymous, but whatever. The effect of a work of art upon the person who enjoys it is an experience different in kind from any experience not of art. Not really sure I'm with you there. Like if I go on a hike and I look out over a pleasing mountain range, to me that's an experience very much akin to the experience of a work of art. I don't really, personally, I'm not able to register any difference. It's just moving. It may be formed out of one emotion or maybe a combination of several, and various feelings inhering for the writer in particular words or phrases or images may be added to compose the final result. Okay, so it's just saying, poets compose poetry out of many different elements. Best words, best order, and those elements represent, various types of things and abstractions and feelings and observations. Okay. Or great poetry can be made without the direct use of any emotion whatever, composed out of feelings solely. I don't know the difference between emotions and feelings, Eliot, so I really don't know what you're saying. But if a poem can be composed out of feelings solely, then I suppose it wouldn't be composed with words. It would just be, pure, unadulterated feelings. I have no idea, dude. But maybe he means that it could be composed more of abstractions and that the kind of emotional state of the poet wouldn't be conveyed, or the emotional state of the characters wouldn't be conveyed. Let's find out. Canto 15 of the Inferno, Brunetto Latini, is a working up of the emotion evident in this situation, but the effect, though single as that of any work of art, is obtained by considerable complexity of detail. So again, he uses this word working up of emotion, even though he says it can be composed of feelings solely, so I don't really know what he means. I think what he means is that it evinces an emotion, even though it's not composed of emotion. So that's the best I can figure there. The last quatrain gives an image, a feeling attaching to an image. I'm not sure what gives an image or a feeling attaching to an image, what the distinction is there, but okay. Which quote unquote came. Is this like a sex thing, Eliot? Did you come when you read this passage? Did you? Which did not develop simply out of what precedes, but which was probably in suspension in the poet's mind until the proper combination arrived for it to add itself to. Okay, so I guess it was as much a surprise to Dante as it is to us. Who knows? It sounds like That would be unprovable, right? Let's go back in time and ask Dante whether he surprised himself with this image. The poet's mind is, in fact, a receptacle for seizing and storing up numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound are present together. Okay, well, let's just look quickly. Here's this, I have this translation of Dante's Inferno. This is text adapted by Sandow Burke and Marcus Sanders. I don't know if it's the best translation or what, but I just happen to have it around so we can use it here. So, he meets his Dante and Virgil meet Dante's former teacher in hell. They walk along with him. His teacher can't stop, or he gets this kind of 100-year punishment, so he has to keep walking at all times. They're talking. Dante, remembers him fondly, and that his teacher is kind of giving him free avuncular advice, how to live a good life and how to stay righteous. And at the end, there's kind of this parting shot. The teacher says, "Look, I really wish I could chat with you more, but I can already see the dust rising from the sands up ahead. I'm not really allowed to talk to newcomers, but before I go, let me recommend my book, The Treasure. It's my best work. Have a look at it. Remember me by it. That's all I can ask." He turned and sprinted off like a runner in the Palio races at Verona, and it seemed, as he went, that he'd be more likely to win than lose if he had half a chance. So I agree, it's a kind of a poignant way to end, that this guy's literally sprinting as if in a race in hell, still fighting the good fight, you could say, even though he's doomed forever. It's kind of poignant. It's interesting. Whether this really illustrates or saves what Eliot is trying to say about thoughts and feelings and emotions and composition, I don't really know, man. Okay, let's go on. If you compare several representative passages of the greatest poetry, you see how great is the variety of types of combination. I agree there. And also how completely any semi-ethical criterion of sublimity, quote-unquote, misses the mark. I'm not sure why he introduces this semi-ethical, why ethics have anything to do with what we're talking about. Maybe he means that other critics introduce some type of like ethics, or maybe he's dissing other critics as being unethical. I don't know. For it is not greatness, quote-unquote, for it is not the greatness, the intensity of the emotions, the components, but the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure, so to speak, under which the fusion takes place that counts. Although I think personally, I feel like it's very difficult to measure the process. It's only possible to measure the outcome, so I think Eliot has things exactly backwards. People could use a pretty weak process but end up with a pretty cool result, and we really wouldn't necessarily know it. Poets don't always work hard to create a great end product. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and it's kind of unpredictable, I feel like. And there's really no way to know most of the time how hard anyone works, right? All we have is the outcome, right? The episode of Paolo and Francesca employs a definite emotion, but the intensity of the poetry is something quite different from whatever intensity the supposed experience it may give the impression of. It is no more intense, furthermore, than Canto 24, The Voyage of Ulysses, which has not the direct dependence upon any emotion. So I'm not, don't immediately recall this episode of Paolo and Francesca, so I'm not going to look that up. The Voyage of Ulysses is where Dante comes across this twinned flame representing Ulysses and his buddy, who are punished in hell for deceiving the Trojans with the Trojan horse. Okay. Great variety is possible in the process of transmutation of emotion. The murder of Agamemnon, the agony of Othello, gives artistic effect apparently closer to a possible original than the scenes of Dante. So what he's saying is, in those plays, in Shakespeare's Othello or in the play Agamemnon, There's this kind of emotional immediacy. I think that's what he's saying. So it's just like it's like gets you immediately. It kind of grabs you immediately, but that doesn't make it more profound in Eliot's estimation. And people could argue about that. That's Eliot's point. And the Agamemnon, the artistic emotion, approximates the emotion of an actual spectator. So in other words, when you're watching the play, it's as if you're there kind of watching what's happening. In Othello, the emotion of the protagonist itself. So in Othello, it's as if you're kind of becoming the Othello character. You end up identifying with the Othello character. But the difference between art and event is always absolute. The combination, which is the murder of Agamemnon, is probably as complex as that which is the voyage of Ulysses. Okay, so I mean, he's comparing these things are very different, kind of apples and oranges. A play has different mechanics and kind of a completely different configuration to its performance than a long poem like Dante's Inferno. So I really think this is kind of a little bit of a hit or miss here. In either case, there's been a fusion of elements. Okay, fine. But that's not so profound, right? The Ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale, but which the nightingale, partly perhaps because of its attractive name, and partly because of its reputation, served to bring together. So just kind of a backhanded compliment at Keats. We know Eliot doesn't like Keats. He doesn't really like any of the romantics, as we'll soon see. Yeah, man. If you compare several representative passages of the greatest poetry, you see how great is the variety of types of combination. Yeah, okay, so we're combining words, right, in different orders. Okay. Didn't someone else say that? Also, how completely any semi-ethical criterion of sublimity misses the mark. Semi-ethical. Well, I'm wholly unethical, so hell yeah. For it is not the greatness... For it is not the greatness, the intensity of the emotions, the components, but the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure, so to speak, under which the fusion takes place. Yeah, I got to take a crap really badly. That's the pressure, right? Sorry. I'm totally not being helpful. The episode of Paolo and Francesca employs a definite emotion, but the intensity of the poetry is something quite different from whatever intensity in the supposed experience it may give the impression of. Okay, so he's basically talking about poetry. The poetry that he thinks is the hotness is poetry with certain intensity or concentration, right? That's what he's after. Like, concentration of language is the shit for him. It is so fucking important. Okay, so we can understand that's what he's saying. Yeah. It is no more intense, furthermore, than Canto, 26, The Voyage of Ulysses, which, so I don't have that on hand. Sorry, bro. Sorry, guys. The Voyage of Ulysses, which has not the direct dependence upon an emotion. Great variety is possible in the process of transmutation of emotion. The murder of Agamemnon or the agony of Othello gives an artistic effect apparently closer to a possible origin than the scenes from Dante. So he's saying the emotions of those scenes are different than concentration, right? Sorry, I misread this a little bit. Sorry. Great variety is possible in the process of transmutation of emotion. The murder of Agamemnon or the agony of Othello gives an artistic effect apparently closer to a possible original than the scenes from Dante. In the Agamemnon, the artistic emotion approximates to the emotion of an actual spectator. In Othello, to the emotion of the protagonist himself. But the difference between art and the event is always absolute. So he's saying art could imitate and therefore give us emotions that are close to our experiences in real life and trick us into believing that we're experiencing those things. Therefore, those emotions become very real to us. But art is never real. right? In either case, there's been a fusion of elements. So although the emotions can feel really real, what's important to Eliot is this fusion or combination of things which creates this intensity. The Ode of Keats contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale, but which the nightingale, partly perhaps because of its attractive name and partly because of its reputation, served to bring together. Okay, it's kind of a little bit of a diss to Keats there in the Nightingale. Okay, a little bit of a diss. You know, so he's saying because Keats chose to write a poem about a nightingale, and nightingale has a really fucking cool name. Like nightingale just sounds rad. That's gonna therefore mean that the poem works better, or it's like a cheat code for Keats. All right. All right. Well, Eliot's honest here. The point of view which I'm struggling to attack, that's for damn sure, because it's clear as mud here, is perhaps related to the metaphysical theory of the substantial unity of the soul. Okay. So it comes out and says it here. So he's saying he believes in an immortal soul, and that all of our souls, I suppose, are united in some way, or part of God, I guess. For my meaning is that the poet has not a, quote, personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. So there's definitely a metaphysics here, guys. Metaphysics has a lot to do with his Christianity, right? So all this science analogy is kind of like a sleight of hand, because this really isn't going to be science. It's going to be meta-science, pseudoscience. I mean, sorry. I mean, what else is this, right? I mean, it's like kind of bonkers. However, it's kind of interesting, right? So he believes that the poet basically operates with the soul and not with the heart. Like you can use emotions, and emotions can convey things, but it's the soul that's really you have to learn how to use effectively as a poet. Right. I wish he'd just come out and say that, but he doesn't. For my meaning is that the poet has not a blah blah blah, and not which impressions experience combined in peculiar and unexpected ways. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man may take no place in the poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may play quite a negligible part in the man, the personality. I am not 100% sold. I mean, there's certainly been things in my life which I've tried to put in a poem which really haven't worked, and I've tried again and again, and they haven't worked. And some things that feel sort of ancillary to my life or not particularly important that have worked well. But that could just be coincidence, or could be, I haven't approached things the correct way. I'm not really sure I could attribute that to, the soul per se, that there's like an immortal poet inside of me. I don't really know, man. I mean, I just think it's intrinsic in poetry that's a little bit hit or miss. You need to kind of fire a lot of bullets in order to find the right subject and the right way to approach a subject. I agree with Eliot, as you gain some more experience, sometimes that can become a little easier, but there does seem to be some topics that just are going to be difficult to write a poem about. And again, I'm not sure that has much to do with the soul. I will quote a passage which is unfamiliar enough to be regarded with fresh attention in the light or darkness of these observations. Okay, let's see. And now methinks I could e'en chide myself for doting on her beauty, though her death shall be revenged after no common action. Does the silkworm expend her yellow labors for thee? For thee does she undo herself, our lordships sold to maintain ladyships for the poor benefit of a bewildering minute. And why does yon fellow falsify highways and put his life between the judge's lips to refine such a thing, keeps horse and men to beat their valors for her? In this passage, as it is evident if it is taken in its context, there's a combination of positive and negative emotions and intensely strong attraction toward beauty and an equal intense fascination by the ugliness which is contrasted with it and which destroys it. This balance of contrasted emotion is the dramatic situation to which the speech is pertinent. In other words, so talking about like, you want to do these, these people want to do these things that sound evil or sound bad in order to obtain or secure beauty. So that's like the kind of the dramatic situation of the poem. Maybe it's not dramatic, but it's this contrast in the poem. But the situation alone is inadequate to it. So in other words, there's not a lot of actual like dramatic action in the poem. This is, so to speak, the structural emotion provided by the drama. But the whole effect, the dominant tone, is due to the fact that a number of floating feelings having an affinity to this emotion, by no means superficially evident, have combined with it to give us a new art emotion. I'm not exactly sure what he's saying here, other than that this poem shows a kind of procession of different images. Falsify highways, put his life between judges' lips. So there's a kind of a succession of different images shown to us. So that could be what he's saying, that the poem combines these different emotions or experiences in this way to give us this new thing, right? It's not his personal emotions, the emotions provoked by particular events in his life, that the poet isn't in any way remarkable or interesting. His particular emotions may be simple or crude or flat. The emotion in his poetry will be a very complex thing, but not with the complexity of the emotions of people who have very complex or unusual emotions in life. In other words, you can make interesting poetry about simple emotions and about simple facts, okay? One error, in fact, of eccentricity in poetry is to seek for new human emotions to express. And in this search for novelty in the wrong place, it discovers the perverse. Okay. So I can see what he's saying here, which is like just trying to describe like some really idiosyncratic, weird experience that you've had. Or like that weird time when, or just like find really out there kind of things that people enjoy or like that most people wouldn't. Is just kind of like collecting oddities and strangeness, and he calls it perverse. I wouldn't necessarily call it perverse, but is it intrinsically interesting? Is it artful? Is it poetic? It seems like in the era we're living in, there's a whole lot of that. So Eliot is wrong in that front, and like a huge number of poems really are just about unique or strange things. And yeah, I don't find that super impressive. I'm with Eliot there. The business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones and in working them up into poetry to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. Okay, so again, we have this complication here where he hasn't really defined his terms, like what's the difference between a feeling and an emotion. But you could say it's clear Eliot wants us to take these kind of raw ingredients and combine them in novel ways, which isn't really that profound. Okay. And emotions which he's never experienced will serve his turn as well as those familiar to him. I'm not actually sure about that. I think like most emotions are really kind of like basic colors, like a color wheel or color palette. And like everybody has experienced them in some way or another, and like combining them, you kind of have enough to work with if you go with like fear and anger and happiness, and it's just like you're kind of like pretty much good to go. All right. So I'm not really sure that I completely agree. Consequently, we must believe that emotion recollected in tranquility is an inexact formula. Okay. So he's talking about the Romantics. So Wordsworth and Coleridge published this book, Lyrical Ballads, right at the end of the 17th century. So it's like, or 18th century. So it's like right around excuse me, right around the end of the 18th century, so like right at the beginning of the 19th century, they published this book, Lyrical Ballads, which ended up being this like huge influence on the Romantic period. And in the preface, Wordsworth says that poetry is kind of this emotion recollected in tranquility. So that's an exact quote there. And Eliot is saying that it doesn't quite work because it's neither emotion nor recollection nor without distortion of meaning, tranquility. It is concentration in a new thing resulting from the concentration of a very great number of experiences, which the practical and active person would not seem to be experiences at all. It is concentration which does not happen consciously or of deliberation. Wow. Okay. So he's really fighting against this like emotion recollected in tranquility because he's saying it's not necessarily emotions which go into poetry. He has this like weird thing with feelings and experiences which he doesn't define or explain exactly, and which I don't really agree with. And then he doesn't like recollection because he prefers some other process to do with the soul, I suppose. And I don't know how the soul does stuff because he certainly doesn't explain that. But he doesn't like this idea of just like, hey, think about something that's happened, some experience that you've had or that you've observed, and sit down in a quiet place for a while, calm yourself down, and then see what happens. See if you can kind of work that up into a poem. It seems like he would like that idea, but he really doesn't like that idea. He fucking hates that idea because he feels like that's too deliberate a process. That process privileges kind of deciding things and using your kind of consciousness and I guess your emotions and your heart ultimately more than your soul, right? So that's about all I can figure here. These experiences are not recollected, and they finally unite in an atmosphere which is, quote, tranquil only in that it is a passive attending upon the event. That's kind of poorly written, Mr. Eliot. I'm sorry to tell you. Of course, this is not quite the whole story. There's a great deal in the writing of poetry which must be conscious and deliberate. Oh, I certainly agree with you there, dude. In fact, the bad poet is usually unconscious where he ought to be conscious and conscious where he ought to be unconscious. How the hell we're supposed to tell whether a poet is being conscious or unconscious in a certain passage, or whether they themselves would even know, is something that, man, I just fucking think like I'm fucking. Both errors tend to make him personal, quote unquote. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. I don't agree with that at all, bro. But an escape from personality. Okay, well, I think if like we over-impress the reader with our own personality and we try to force personality on the reader, it's not going to work. But some poets have a very strong, unavoidable persona. Maybe it's their personality, maybe it's not. That feels kind of inescapable. I don't know, man. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. Okay, you're kind of just like talking in circles here, but all right, he clearly doesn't like the romantics, okay? So he really doesn't like this emotion recollected in tranquility. He doesn't like the idea of writing a poetry from the heart. He probably doesn't like the idea of writing poems that are kind of easily understandable and relatable to a vast majority of people, which is what the romantics were after, poetry that could speak to the kind of common man. And he's after something else. He's after a concentration of language that he finds in certain poems from certain eras, and that I suppose he is the judge of what has sufficient concentration and what does not. And Mr. Eliot decides, and all of us are nincompoops. All right, we have a little bit of Greek here. I think this is from Aristotle. It's about the mind presumably having some sort of divinity. I could double check with my wife, but she ain't around, and she's probably not interested in helping me with this stuff. All right, but you can Google it. I trust. This essay proposes to halt at the frontier of metaphysics or mysticism. I'm not really sure that you really did, though, Eliot. I'm not really sure that you did. I think you pretty much drove right on through and confined itself to such practical conclusions as can be applied by the responsible person interested in poetry. Well, we're not the responsible people, although we are interested in poetry, but I don't really know how responsible you are either. To divert interest from the poet to the poetry is a laudable aim. Amen, brother, for it would conduce to a juster estimation of actual poetry, good and bad. Hey, that's why my lit mag, we read blind. We don't pay any attention to the names. We're just reading the poetry, all right? I don't know if Eliot did that in his life when he was editing, though, all right? There are many people who appreciate the expression of sincere emotion in verse, and there is a small number of people who can appreciate technical excellence. Again, this would seem to be no controversy territory, but very few know when there is an expression of significant emotion, emotion which has its life in the poem and not in the history of the poet. Okay, I think I see what he's getting at. He's saying that there's a plane of experience that, or the world of the poem, and great poets can give a poem an energy that seems to be beyond all of the resources and all of the things that went into it. And I could agree that a great poem is more than the sum of its parts. How that operates and how we are moved by something, I don't know if this essay is really discussed. I would say it has something to do with harmony, perhaps, a concept of harmony that he has not approached. The emotion of art is impersonal, and the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. Again, that's possible, that's possible, but when a poet believes they're surrendering themselves to something, are they really surrendering themselves to something, or do they just believe that they're doing that? And who's to judge how complete the surrender was? Again, these things don't seem to be that objective to me. I mean, I agree when you really put yourself into something, whether that thing is golf or poetry or mathematics or candle making, you're going to get a better result than if you half-ass stuff. So put yourself into it, right? But I don't really agree with his metaphysical framework here. And the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. And he is not likely to know what is to be done unless he lives in what is not merely the present, but the present moment of the past, unless he is conscious not of what is dead, but what is already living. Thanks for joining me on this little adventure. And hopefully we got some context on this famous essay together. And drop in below and let me know what you think of Dear Tom Stearns. All right, later on, folks.